The racist massacre at the Tops Market last weekend has put a spotlight on an ugly truth here in Buffalo. We are one of the most racially segregated cities in the country. The suspect's online postings show that he specifically picked the 14208 zip code because of its concentration of black people. A study back in 2018 found that 85% of the people who identify as black in Buffalo live east of Main Street. And get this, of the 51 census block groups that had limited access to supermarkets, every single one of them was on the east side. Joining us live right now is the author of that study. Anna Blatto is a researcher at the Partnership for the Public Good. It's great to have you on, Anna. I wonder, you found a pretty stark level of segregation in this city. I think that part is clear. What has led to this divide?
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm glad to be able to share a little bit of this history to folks who may not be as familiar. There are a lot of different factors that played into the segregation that we do see today in Buffalo and across the country, really, in a lot of major cities with significant Black populations. In the 1920s and 30s, just prior to that, the Great Migration brought a lot of folks from the Jim Crow South into the northern cities. And a lot of them came for job opportunities, but some of them to kind of escape the post-slavery era environment that really plagued the South. And when they came to northern cities, they were met with a lot of different types of racism, and some of them were very explicit and some of them were more subtle. One very prominent practice that really reflects the geography that we see today was redlining. And redlining was named as such because a series of maps were created by the FHA in the 1920s that identified certain areas' level of risk. So the folks who lived in certain areas would have a higher or lower level of risk when it came to mortgage lending. And what ended up happening was race played a huge factor in whether the area was designated as okay to lend to or not. And when the maps were created for Buffalo, communities of color, heavily Black populated communities were overwhelmingly redlined. And when you compare those redlining maps from then to now, the communities that are segregated in Buffalo today, that still have a very high concentration of Black residents, were those communities that were redlined way back then. And that led to a lot of different factors. It led to the limitations of participating in the mainstream financial institutions, not only for mortgages, but also for getting loans to invest in businesses and really amplify communities. And redlining practices, they were made illegal in the 1970s, or prior to the 1970s, and the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977 kind of solidified the bank's responsibilities to reinvest in communities that were historically disinvested in. Although that policy did get put in place, there are still a lot of practices that exist to this day that contribute to persisting segregation.
And yeah, Anna, I know that, acknowledging the history and understanding the history is so important. I've only got about 30 seconds left, but I do want to ask you about the practical impacts that this has had that continue to this day.
Absolutely. So segregation impacts so many different things. It impacts different outcomes like poverty level. It impacts education level, housing quality, how much of your income that you're spending on your housing, impacts banking availability, food access. Almost every single facet of life is related to the neighborhood that you live in. And some neighborhoods do not have the level of opportunity that others do. And this persistent segregation plays a huge role in that.
We need to do a podcast about this because it's time unlimited and there's so much to discuss. We're going to work on something and talk to you again. Anna Blatto is a researcher at the Partnership for the Public Good. Such an important part of this. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.